Welcome, everyone. I am the man behind the slide right now. But my name is Jonathan Jones, and I'll be your moderator today for this session. I would like to welcome you to the final session of the Phys Ed Summit. Thank you so much for joining us all day for this global event. We could have not made this day happen without you. We are very humbled by the support of the summit and each of you. By sharing what you will learn with just one person, you are impacting hundreds of students. Thank you so much for being here. Remember that if for some reason the video feed stops, please check out the toggle for the new link. It may take us a few minutes to get us rolling again, but we thank you for your patience. Reminder that all day people have been earning badges and posting them on Twitter. If you're interested in knowing more about the badge system and how you can earn badges viewing sessions at the Phys Ed Summit, please visit the Phys Edagogy homepage or view the awesome video by Matt Pomeroy that was posted on the Phys Edagogy account earlier today. Chatting on Toggle is a great way to learn more about the session. And feel free to share on social media using the hashtag PhysEdSummit. At the end of this presentation, please visit the Flipgrid link that is in the toggle to share how you can use the information that you will learn in this session in your own classes. If you post to Flipgrid, you will be entered in to win one of 2 premium subscriptions to Flipgrid, which is a great tool for teachers. And now, without any further ado, I would like to introduce you to our presenter today.
Hi, everyone. Jonathan, are we on? Are we rolling?
Yes, we are on and we are rolling, Martha.
Excellent. Thanks, everybody, for being here so late at night. I don't know about anyone else, but I've had a wonderful time today, popping in and out of sessions and figuring out what all is going on. So without further ado, we're going to jump to the slides because nobody needs to see this at 11 o'clock at night. And we'll roll through that. If you have questions, please do post them to Tazel. Jonathan's going to jump in and interrupt me with them. I really hope this becomes a conversation as much as it can in this platform in this shortest time. So roll that beautiful bean footage, please, Jonathan. All right. So when you first logged on, Jonathan, can we go back one slide just to make sure everybody saw it? I asked you to sign in by sharing either your Myers-Briggs letters, StrengthsFinder Top 3. Those are both 2 sort of personality typography inventories as a way to get to know one another. And if you hadn't done one of those, to do your preferred pronouns or your preferred learning style. And we can go to the next slide. That question is there very intentionally to ensure that we understand that as we start this conversation about equity and as we start this conversation about working as a profession as well as individuals within the profession to moving the needle, we have to understand that equity is not about other people or other people's children. That equity is going to be about each and every one of us. And if there's one narrative that I hope that we can all in our own little corners as well as in the world around us interrupt, it's the narrative that in order to address the needs of some, we have to take away from others. And I really don't think we need to do that in order to provide equitable resources and equitable support so that all children can succeed in school. So that was the purpose of the first piece, was to see what kind of diversity we had out there. But thinking about that, we're going to roll right into this next little part here. So, and I'm on a different slides setting, so it's trying to go back and forth to make sure I know what you're seeing. So a little bit about who I am. I am a 25-year veteran of urban education. I spent 21 years in pre-K-12 and have spent the last 4.5 in higher education. My career has really evolved. I began working overseas, working with a lot of students who were second language speakers, and then as a adapted physical education teacher for 5 years, which brought me to a point where I did my master's work on interdisciplinary learning, specifically on teaching reading and pre-reading through movement experiences. Then I went on and got my doctorate in sort of a social justice realm. My doctorate is actually in critical pedagogy, and my dissertation is physical education as a medium for anti-racist consciousness raising. And people have asked me how I made that leap, going from rigorous standards-based academics to thinking about social justice. And the picture that I shared in the last slide was actually of me in microgravity. And that's when the question first started, when I was doing a project with NASA, working on the physics of rotational motion in microgravity with kids. And people are like, wait, I thought you were a social justice person. Wait, what are you doing being a STEM person? And the reality is that yes, and yes. Ensuring that kids have a high quality, rigorous education is social justice. Ensuring, to me, the definition of equity is that students come from, that educational outcomes are not based on zip code, social identity, or socioeconomic status. And if we can get to a point where we have that kind of educational equity, we can really move things for people in the world. So that's enough about me, but if you have other questions, do feel free to reach out, to shout, send me a tweet, message me, and I'm happy to tell you about my journey. And I can only hope for young professionals or professionals who are on the fence about where to go. I really hope that your professional journey is as winding and curved as mine has been. Because what led me from teaching middle school physical education through adapted physical education, elementary PE, being an administrator at the building level, an administrator at the district level, has now situated me in a place where I'm in higher education, teaching undergraduate students, as well as serving as a school board member in Baltimore City, serving the 82,000 students in our district to help ensure that equity is present for them every day. So my bell didn't work, Jonathan. I think I'll just say switch. It's a cumbersome bell.
Yeah, I mean, I like the bell though, so.
Oh, okay. We'll try the bell again for the listeners.
Okay.
There we go. All right. So a couple objectives really quickly here. You're great readers, so I'll let you go ahead with that, and you can hold me accountable to those at the end. So looking at why I titled this session, The Anatomy of Inequality. I titled this session, The Anatomy of Inequality, because there are some very, very real health disparities for people in poverty and people who are living with historical disconnection from their body, and as well as for our kinesthetic and our context-dependent learners. For those students who depend on kinesthetic movement to learn, who are looking at schools as being their primary places and spaces where they have physical activity, their primary places for nutrition and health and wellness education, it really becomes a moral imperative that physical education be the center of the school. Physical education has the opportunity to be a central gathering point for teaching school climate and school culture. I will argue that school culture is primarily determined by the caliber and instruction of the physical educator. But the real health disparities are there and can be interrupted. We know from Dr. Ratty's work about BDNF and the role of neurotransmitters with learning. We know from other work about how students who are raised in concentrated poverty, their rods and cones don't develop the same. And if your rods and cones aren't developing the same because of a lack of contrast in color and a lack of visual stimulation, reading becomes much more challenging. We know that if you're not running and crawling and throwing things, that your cross-lateral movement is interfered with. We also know that the rates of things like diabetes, obesity, at risk of overweight, exactly parallel the disparities of academic achievement. So why the anatomy of inequality? Because we're bodily professionals. So we start with the body, and there are very real bodily factors for students. There are also real bodily solutions to many of these factors. So we're going to talk about some of those places and spaces tonight. All right, so some of the disparities that are caused, I mentioned the diabetes earlier. If you look at rates of asthma and allergies, my cats for some reason are going crazy right now. I apologize, everyone. There's also the institutional pieces, things like redlining in neighborhoods that prevented people of color from living, or people who are Jewish or of different backgrounds, immigrant families, from living in integrated neighborhoods, which created the ability for people of privilege to fence them off, either literally or figuratively, without green spaces, without access to proper nutrition. I currently live in a, for real, honest to goodness, food desert. You have to drive over a mile to get to any kind of quality fresh fruit, vegetables, any quality meat. There's also the cultural factors of historically when people have been told not to engage. This country, not to go too deep on this one, but this country was founded on a capitalistic principle, on excess human labor. And because of that, we have a long embedded cellular memory and understanding that we've bought into, that people who work with their bodies are somehow less valuable than people who work with their minds. So of course that is going to translate into who gets to exercise and who shouldn't, who is able to participate, and what activities people are able to participate in are very much determined by their cultural, historical, and economic background. And then there's all the personal reasons why someone would want to avoid physical activity and wellness in order to maintain a culture, whether it's lard in your refried beans, or you know, a ham hock in your greens, or too much pasta, as we, you know, is the #1 food in America. There's those personal pieces that we need to consider as we look at the systemic understandings of inequalities and their outcomes, as well as some of the solutions to address them. So, I put my bell down, dang it. So as Shape America goes to its 50 million strong, one of the big reasons that this is incredibly important to us as health and physical educators right now is that 50 million is how many students are roughly enrolled in public schools in the United States today. And if we mean 50 million strong, that means all students. And with roughly 1 in 5 students speaking a first language other than English, 50% or more of our students being from low income, more than 50% of our students in today's public schools are non-white, and up to 13% are known to have a special need. If we mean 50 million, then cultural fluency has to be a part of our language in addressing those students and their needs, or we will simply not get them all. And if we don't understand the sociocultural and historical context that kids bring to us in their ideas about movement and their ideas about health and wellness, and if we don't intentionally interrupt that narrative, we won't be able to move the needle for anywhere near 50 million of our students. So cultural fluency, I think, is one of the key pieces we can use to move that needle. And I think it's important for the profession. As a profession of physical educators, we are fighting a historical understanding of who we were that was a bullying, belittling, demeaning, and often, if there's a word, about unefficizing. So doing the exact opposite of what we were intending to do, by teaching that he who is strongest and he who is fastest wins. And so we need to, as a profession, really look at where are we culturally? How are we meeting the needs, not even specifically of any particular racial, ethnic, religious, gender group, but how are we meeting the needs of 21st century students? If we're teaching an entirely sports-skilled, competitive curriculum, are we teaching for the kids that we have? And are we teaching for the life they need to lead? We also need to look at cultural fluency for us as the individual professional. As we grow and as we work in education and as laws change and policies change, if we are not professionals at the cutting edge, then we're not only diminishing the power of the profession in general, but we're also limiting our own capacity to be seen as professionals, to be respected, to engage in the community, which thereby limits our ability to impact students, which is the biggest piece. And why we need cultural fluency for our students is because the cliche that students will remember how you treated them more than what you taught them. They need to know who you are before they know what you know. All of those things are ways of saying that if you can't have a relationship with your students, then you're not going to be able to be as effective as they need you to be. And that doesn't mean you have to be best friends, but if you don't know where they come from and you don't know who they are, and you don't know first and foremost who you are, then it's going to be a really big challenge for you to meet students' needs. So what is cultural fluency? Woo, my slides just went crazy. Cultural fluency is an expansion of cultural competency, just as anti-racism is an expansion of multiculturalism, whereby it adopts an openly political position that emphasizes the need to identify and resist racism on a personal, institutional, theoretical, and practical level. By developing cultural fluency, it allows professionals to adapt to the changing needs of a diverse society, as well as to examine, understand, and interrupt the ideologies that perpetuate essentializing biases. So there's a bunch of words in there. And one of the biggest pieces to understand about that is that there is an understanding within cultural fluency that there's sort of two big pods of need to be addressed issues. One of them being institutional biases, the other being personal bad behaviors. And the problem when we get into conversations about political correctness and things like that is we get wrapped up into what he said or what she said versus why they had the implicit underlying belief that caused them to say that. So we're going to dig into that a little bit as we move through tonight. But we really need to understand that one of the things we have to do on a culturally fluent journey is to separate the institutional from the individual. Because yes, I'm in policy and I have a lot of power within the school system, but I'm not able to change the institution of the school. You can't turn the Titanic on a dime. But what I can do is I can change my own personal behavior and influence the institutional. And that's where we all land, is whether you've got the kind of leverage power that I have as a board member, whether you're on your city council, whether you're on your school council, or whether you are doing the best you can to survive your first year of teaching. We start with ourselves, and then we can impact and influence from there. So cultural fluency is a theoretical framework that I developed as a way to look at, it actually is a response to cultural competency. So when I was in K-12, there were all these cultural competency trainings that people were going to and getting these lovely certificates that they put on their wall or they turned in for credits at the end of the year that said they were culturally competent, meaning that it was a terminal event that you could finish at some point. So I developed cultural fluency in part response to that, because interaction between cultures is a constantly evolving, constantly nuanced event that I wanted a better way of looking at it. The other response that I developed this for was in response to the fact that in sitting in said cultural competency trainings over years, there was often the impression given that this was only work for some of us. And well, yes, there are some of us that need a lot more work than others, and there's some of us that have been in this work a lot longer than others. Your socialized identity, so your gender, your religion, your race, your ethnicity, does not mean that you're precluded from learning about others. So the idea of cultural fluency says that it is absolutely imperative to be first, as a foundational premise, literate in your own language. So your own identity. Do you know who you are, who your identities are? It is also absolutely imperative that you critically reflect on that identity and what are the privileging and oppressing aspects of that identity. How are you engaging in external experiences? And then the last sort of foundational premise around cultural fluency is that we have to have grace and space for one another to understand that as we are all on a journey of learning about those that are like us, learning about those that are different than us, and learning about ourselves first and foremost, we're going to make mistakes. We're going to say stupid things. We're going to say uneducated things. We're going to say things that could be interpreted as mean. The only way we can change any of that is through relationship experience and practice. So social construction, really quickly as a background, and I know people have a wide variety of prior experiences coming to this, or at least the three of you, I'm assuming, are there at 11:15 at night. Social construction relies on the process of socialization, where individuals learn and internalize customs, habits, and values. And two really crystal clear examples that you see on the screen of things that we in this society have decided what they mean. We have made a social decision to say that a minute is a minute. we've made a socialized decision to say that, 10 p.m. is the time we stop making phone calls to one another. We say that work meetings should probably not start before 7 a.m. Those are all socially constructed ideologies. The value of money is a social construct. And as are things like race, religion, gender, sexuality. So what I'm going to do now is, it's been a few minutes. I'm going to ask you to maybe stand up while we go to this next slide in just a second. Jonathan, I've rang the bell yet. Thanks.
Gotcha.
Hopefully you're smiling. When we go to the next slide, what I'd like you to do is, if you have a piece of paper handy, write it down. If you don't, make a mental list. If you're falling asleep, write it with your foot. Just going to take about 30 seconds and look at the picture and tell me what socially constructed identities do you see represented in this picture? So looking at this picture, 30 seconds or so, making a list, hopefully standing up during this time, get your blood flowing a little bit. And if you could, go ahead and just write those identities down in the tassel. Maybe it's just us here, Jonathan.
No, there are actually a lot of people in the tassel talking.
Okay, so we see gender. We see men in charge. So we see gender. And in that gender, we see masculinity. And in that gender, we also see a socially constructed identity of leadership. That's all that men in charge. Thanks, Jonesy. Oh, happy lunch hour, Natalie. Yeah, so we see men. Do you see any other socially constructed identities in this picture besides gender? Okay, what kind of diversity, Joe? Natalie says she sees gender, she sees race, she sees who's leading and who's following. So by management, Lindell, I'm going to go that that's some social class that you see. Is that accurate? That you're seeing social status? Lance, I think you're probably going the same thing. So Joe sees racial diversity. So she sees probably some black, some white. Do you see anything else? Okay, GPC says professionals. So I'm going to categorize that as well as social class. So I'm going to ask you this question. Does anybody see religion in this picture? So things that are socially constructed are going to be things like gender, maybe some possibly Hispanic. So corporate, again, is going to be a socioeconomic status. Physically attractive is going to be a social response. And lots of people, thank you all. We didn't see religion. But why didn't we see religion? Would we have seen religion only if we had seen a hijab? Would we see religion only if we had seen a Moor's hat? Would we have seen religion only if we'd have seen a yarmulke? So as we go to the next picture, I share this with you because culture is like water. In the prior picture, we didn't see religion because we didn't see anything that was different than the traditional Christianity we live in. And they may not be Christian. They may be agnostic. They may be atheist. They may be Jewish. We don't know. But because we didn't see anything that stood out and said, oh, they are X, Y, and Z, then the assumption is that they're, quote, normal or typical, which in this case would mean Christian in the United States. You say the same thing with white folk when we say, well, we don't have a culture. Well, we most assuredly do have a culture, and that's part of cultural fluency is for white folk to learn their culture. And that doesn't mean that I'm going to go back to my Celtic roots. That means I need to understand what power, privilege, and oppression that I have intersecting in this culture, because that's my culture. That's my habitus of being, how I do things. So just like we didn't see religion because something wasn't different, doesn't mean it's not there. So can we go back to the last slide for a second, Jonathan? I should have put this in twice. I apologize. So looking here again, just thinking one more time about socially constructed identities. and ask you, which do you think of these socially constructed identities, race, ethnicity, religion, gender, sexual orientations, geography, socioeconomic status, what do you think is the most important socially constructed variable in this picture? If you go ahead and write that in the tassel. What is the most important socially constructed identity in the picture?
What are the socially constructed identities?
What do you think the most important? What do you think the most important socially constructed identity? So I've got two genders. Clearly, gender is a huge factor. Okay. So now I'm going to ask you. I'm going to ask Jonathan to pause just a second. I'm going to ask him to flip slides, and I want you to tell me what the most important socially constructed identity of the next person in the next picture is. Go ahead, go 2 slides. Is he black? Is he male? Is he Christian? Is he straight? Is he poor? Or is his primary social identity his body? And I ask you that, and I ask you to sit with that for a second. Because as soon as we realize that profundity, then we realize our power as physical and health educators to interrupt all of these narratives, to truly take privilege, power, and oppression and flip it, to be able to say, I get to claim my body. I get to live in my body. I am not going to say my body is too wrinkly or too fat or too skinny or not tall enough because that's what society says, because that's a social construct, folks. If we can welcome children and young people back into their bodies, then we can give them the kind of agency and efficacy that they need to interrupt all of these other narratives. So, and now I lost my, I went to your page, Jonathan, and I lost my page. Here we go, okay. So, next slide, moving on. So when we talk about then all of these pieces that contribute to what you thought when you looked at both of those pictures, there are explicit thoughts, and explicit thoughts are the things we say, the actions that we do, and there are the implicit thoughts. And the implicit thoughts are those things that usually we know better than to say or do, or we don't know why we think them, we just do. The implicit thoughts are really informed by society at large. I put 2 links down below on the tassel page, one talking about the Harvard Implicit Association test and another link to the test itself. If you're interested in doing a little self-inquiry on where you stand, the first link is a YouTube video that tells you about the test, and the second link is to the test itself. And I highly recommend that people go through and do the Harvard AITs. Interesting little quick side story. I always do them with my students, my undergraduate students and my graduate students. And the responses that students gave for why their answers were wrong were the exact same at my PWI, my predominantly white institution, as my current historically black college is. So all the students were sure that their answers were wrong because they were right-handed or they were left-handed or the algorithm tried to trick them. But I challenge you to go ahead and do that, because it gives you an idea of how powerful the beliefs we're taught to believe are. And so as we go through thinking about cultural fluency and how to become more culturally fluent, understanding that it is a journey and that in many occasions, it's not an overt committing act, it's an omitting act. So and we'll jump right through the next one. Sorry, I forgot to bing for you. So cultural fluency has 3 main parts, and the foundation of it is borrowed directly from literacy fluency. So if we think about learning a second language, and if we think of someone who is fluent, they are able to speak, they are able to understand. So in other words, they're able to send and receive messages that are accurate. So there's three main parts in that. As a child learns to read, or as you learn to pick up a second language, you decode words. Well, my premise is that in a culturally fluent mindset, you approach interpersonal activities in the same way. That you first have to decode what is being said, how is it being said, and that's both verbal, nonverbal communication. And then what is the context of that? And to, both of those pieces, as you become more fluent, they become faster. As you become more fluent in reading, you no longer need to do the electric company, k, at, cat, you just read cat. And eventually you don't even have to read cat, you just know cat when you see it as a sight word. Well, intercultural interaction is like that. You also have to be really clear on the context. For example, groups of individuals behave very differently in different contexts. So I have to understand the context when I walk out my front door. I have to know if the three young men standing on my corner are there because they are waiting for the bus, or if they are there because they are waiting to do some harm to the next person walking by. If I misinterpret that context on either end, there can be a real problem, because I could have really offended someone with a microaggression of tightening my purse or turning the other way. But there's also the very real reality that if I'm not careful in my neighborhood, I could be hurt. And so that context is really important for all of us whenever we go into a new situation. That first we need to decode what's being said, how is it being said, what's the message communicated here, and is that message consistent with the context? If it's not, then I might need to go back and re-decode. I might need to understand for meaning, or I might need to get a third-party input. I might get more information as I try and figure out what's happening in the situation. The third piece is that you need to be able to code shift, and that's code shifting without co-opting. So I don't need to speak like my students in a Ebonic vernacular in order to be understood, but I need to understand some of the shifts of speaking, of eye contact, of gesture, of cadence of conversation, and what that means in different communities so that I am able to be understood. So one of the first premises that I shared with you about cultural fluency is that you had to first do these things with you, that you have to understand your identity. So you have to know your decoding. You have to know what is the habitus of your identities. If you're gay, what is the habitus of your gay community? Because we also can't co-opt one community onto another. So just because I'm really good at middle-aged white women from the Midwest, and I pretty much can decode us all the time, and I can pretty much contextualize us with accuracy most of the time, doesn't mean I can go in that fluently to middle-aged white women from Georgia or middle-aged white women from France. I may have to re-decode and recontextualize. The metaphor there is just like if you're really, really good at reading fiction as a child, once you start reading poetry or informational text, you have to slow down because the vocabulary has changed, the syntax has changed. And so you need to re-decode, contextualize, and understand what parts of yourself you need to modify slightly without losing your identity of who you are in order to be culturally fluent. All right.
We have a couple of questions on the
Sure.
top. Our question from Danielle says, where and how does a cultural fluency begin?
Well, it starts with you. It starts with you and thinking about who you are, understanding your historical and contemporary cultural privileges and oppressions. Where do you have power? Where do you lose power? How has the institution been set up to give you that power? And then how can you mitigate that? So that in your classroom, you're creating a community that is able to work together and being culturally fluent within itself. So we're going to get more to that answer, Danielle, but if I don't hit it hard enough for you, please pop back on. But there's a slide coming up with next steps and what you do as a teacher.
Great. And also, Justin asks, is code shifting the same?
I don't want to answer Justin's question.
Sorry, Justin. Is code shifting the same as code switching?
In much of the literature around English language learners, they are synonymous. I like to think of it more as shifting for a culturally fluent lens, because switching implies that you're going to, it's kind of like the marriage ceremony. This is a weird metaphor, so roll with me, it's late. But the marriage ceremony where, you light the candle together and then she blows hers out and he blows his out. It's like, wait a second, weren't you just two people a second ago? Code switching to me implies that you've left your own identity out. You've now become something else. Code shifting to me is, how do I stay true to me, but meet the needs of my students or accommodate the needs of the context where I am? So that's the difference that I see. But I'm sure that there are scholars in the second language community that would have a far more eloquent differentiation between the two. Anything else immediate? Jonathan, we're moving on.
Nope, we're moving on.
Okay, so we'll go to the next slide really quickly. And not to belabor this, if we had hours and hours I would share, but these are some of the other pieces that are directly borrowed from literacy acquisition that apply to cultural fluency and intercultural interactions. Specifically, the lack of conscious awareness when you can go from one group to another, and you see students like this all the time that are they seamlessly can interact with everyone. In my background, there was a comedian, Eddie G. He's a Hispanic comedian I met a few years ago, and he said to me, he said, Martha, I didn't fit in anywhere growing up, so I learned to fit in everywhere. So his effortlessness in crossing culture, and how he could do it without any awareness, and with that prosody, which is the rhythm and the beauty of language, or in this case, the beauty of social interaction, because he had practiced it so much. And that's going to be absolutely critical, is that this takes practice. And as I said before, it takes a whole lot of grace to make that practice happen. So one of the places where we can begin, to get back to Danielle's question, is on the next slide. And I can't see you right now, but raise your hand if you've seen this little graphic before. There's a lot of things that I love about this graphic. I love that it's at a diamond game, because as soon as people in the real world, and when I say the real world, I mean the outside of PE world, the people we're trying to convince that health and PE matter, when we get outside there and we go, but wait a second, we're all worried about them watching a diamond game? Oh, you mean physical activity matters? Oh, you mean sports is a way to transmit culture? Oh, so I love that it's at a game. But I think this image is woefully inadequate. And it's woefully inadequate, not because we need to understand differentiating between equity and equality, but because we need to understand our role, which is our goal, which is developing agency in kids. So if you could go to the next slide. This graphic, I think, is far more applicable. Yes, we have equity, we have equality, but why not take down the damn fence? Why not say this is a barrier that didn't need to be there? Let's move it. And if it was there for their safety, why not make it chain link so they could see through? So that's social justice, but I think that we as health and physical educators have an even bigger calling. In the development of agency, an agency is the ability for individuals to understand and advocate for themselves and their needs, to be able to be representative of the goals of their society. In order to be able to do that, we truly need to develop agency, in which case I say, as health and physical educators, why not teach them to climb the blasted fence? So that is the difference between that first slide where we give them a box to look over a fence that we've put in their way, or we take down the fence, but since we have access to their bodies, we have access to their understandings of how they can deconstruct their socially constructed bodies that they've been told are too fat or too slow or too awkward or too tall or too anything, too black, too curly, too straight, too red, whatever it is, if we teach them to climb the fence, do you think any of that matters to these kids anymore? So I just, as we go through, keeping in mind as that culturally fluent teachers, a primary goal of yours in your classroom every day is to develop agency in your students. And how are you doing that? How are you creating space for student voice so that students can develop movement efficacy as well as their ability to be agents in their own life? So we know that experiences are what create our beliefs or our ideas, and our ideas and our beliefs are what shape our actions. And this is a recursive process. So in a culturally fluent model, what we want to do is have as many experiences as possible. When we think about people who we're frustrated with, maybe that we work together with, or people in our family, or, as we go home to Thanksgiving and hope that no one brings up, say, politics at all right now, have a little space for those people who are running counter to your world, because they've had very different experiences. And it's those experiences that have shaped their ideas. No amount of belittling or hollering at people over Thanksgiving dinner is going to change their actions. The only thing that's going to change their actions is changing their ideas. And the only way to change their ideas is through changing experiences. And we as teachers know that fundamental to that is relationship. So as you're on your own personal journey, challenge yourself. When was the last time you were the only one of you somewhere? How did that feel? How did you understand your privilege or your oppression in that? Example of that was when I was living in St. Paul and teaching, and one of my students invited me to come to Hmong New Year with her family. So we go down to the Excel Energy Center, and they wanted me all dressed up, and that was a little awkward to me because I'm not about code switching, but it was what the family wanted. So I'm dressed and I go to this event, and there's thousands and thousands and thousands of Hmong people and me. And there's a smattering of white folk, a smattering of black folk. But it hit me when I got bumped into, and a security officer stepped up and said, "Ma'am, are you okay?" The level of privilege that I had, if that building had caught on fire, that man would have made sure I got out of there before anyone else. And that's not something that I did intentionally. I didn't go out and say, "Oh, I'm going to assert my white privilege." But I do have to, in that experience, reflect on it and understand that my level of privilege comes with me, and that I can either use that for good, or I can understand how it impacts others and use that understanding for good. So as we're thinking about developing cultural fluency and moving through this idea together, that we have to be able to have experiences and then critically reflect on them in order to move forward. So this slide just, you bet. So yeah. We'll go to the slide that looks like the last one.
Okay.
That ends in, yep, perfect.
And then our question from Artaza is, what can be considered acceptable in terms of seeing other cultural identities? And also, how can an international atmosphere avoid misinterpretation and misunderstanding?
Jonathan, can you read the first part of the question again? Sorry.
Yes. What can be considered acceptable in terms of seeing other cultural identities?
Of seeing other cultural identities?
Yeah.
So, okay. I want to be able to just give a really crystal clear answer. But certainly you don't want to look at life as a voyeur. And I think back to my confirmation class when I was in 9th grade, and we went to the temple and we sat through a service. That felt very much like I was going to a zoo and looking at the animals rather than engaging. So I think things like, if we're talking about working with kids, I think things like service learning or extended interaction help. As far as adults, if you are going to sort of a voyeur event, like I'm going to go to the powwow and I'm going to, buy my brat and sit and watch this amazing dancing, understanding that you are a voyeur in that setting and contextualizing that and saying, okay, this is a view, of one snapshot moment in an American Indian life. This is not that guy's life. This is not that woman's complete being. So I think it's all about understanding that, contextualizing and reflecting as we go to see, or even better, be with people in community. And if I didn't hit that hard enough, again, I invite you to bounce back. As far as in the international context, having been a former international teacher, and if anybody's got the dream job out there, I'd think about it again. Just going and doing and being as much a part of and not a viewer of. I think that there's a level of risk taking that we have to have as people on a cultural fluency journey to be able to be vulnerable. Vulnerability is the birthplace of transformation and change. And so that requires taking some leaps, certainly not in a physical danger, but in a emotional risk or a put yourself out there kind of way, to be the only one or one of the only ones, to make sure that you're getting the most experiences that you can. Are there anything else, Jonathan? Or we?
No, we can go ahead and move on.
Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So I've been throwing out this hashtag because, especially as we look at ESSA and we look at changes in policy, what and how we teach matters. So if we're looking at cultural fluency, it is both what we do and how we do it matter immensely. Again, if we want to get more out of our students than their zip code or their socioeconomic status predicts, then we need to be incredibly intentional about looking at our curriculum. And back to Danielle's point, a place to start is to say, what does your curriculum overtly teach? And if your curriculum overtly teaches football, soccer, volleyball, basketball, then what your curriculum is inadvertently, or what we call in this work the hidden curriculum, what your curriculum is inadvertently teaching is that in order to be physically active, you have to have a team. In order to participate in physical activity, someone has to lose. In order to participate in physical activity, you must have rigid rules. And as a halfway runner, I don't have a whole lot of rules. I run until I don't feel like running anymore. So we need to look at what we're teaching and how that matters for our kids. And then we need to look at how we're teaching it. If we're teaching only by basic rote memorization, recall kind of questions, we're not going to get to where kids need to be. If we're not teaching in ways that value their home culture or value the historical influences on their perspectives and their families' perspectives on physical activity, health and wellness, then that message is not going to go through. Because when we go back and think about that, experiences mean ideas mean actions. Well, if you've got enough experiences and your current school experience is disconnected to your home experience or discongruent with your home experience, then you won't develop the idea because you won't learn that piece. So the place to start is looking at what we teach as well as how we teach. So as we move towards a culturally fluent pedagogy, understanding that foundationally good teaching is good teaching is good teaching. It means if you are building those relationships, if you're outside your classroom shaking hands or fist bumping with your students, if you are using triple action partners, which I've talked about in other presentations, where you're working with having every student work with every student throughout the day, if you are differentiating for instruction, then you're already a long way towards meeting the culturally fluent needs of your students. Now, if you're there, then it's time to simply begin or continue on your journey of understanding who you are. And if you're teaching in a setting that's as dynamic as my K-12 setting was in St. Paul, that culture is going to change all the time. We need to examine current practices. Things like, how are we assessing our students? Are we grading on culturally or on socially constructed variables like dressing out? Are we grading differently based on gender identities? How are we working with and accepting students as they transition? Basically, thinking about culturally fluent pedagogy isn't rocket science. It isn't crazy. It's just being cognizant and being intentional about what you're doing. So again, to go on, it's about knowing yourself. It's about creating student voice and student choice. And if you get a chance, Justin, want to throw your PowerPoint up from Shape. Justin has a great, concise, he worked with a couple other people, with Mel and Nick, on student voice and choice. Amazing stuff out there. But making sure that you're hearing your students' voices, making sure that there is place for dissent and discord. Looking at trauma-informed rituals and routines. If you have students coming in and sitting in squads, is that saying, ooh, love your neighbor, or is that saying, ooh, look at the back of your neighbor's head? I also would really challenge everyone out there, and this is me as a school board member, not me as anything else, but me pleading with you, as schools begin to embrace trauma-responsive and trauma-informed teaching and learning, please, 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 health and physical educators, help your schools understand that it is not a social work add-on service. The trauma-informed teaching and learning starts with the curriculum. It's the how and what, because how and what matters. And yes, many of our students who are coming from traumatic backgrounds and have the toxic stress built up over time need additional support from trained professionals. The majority of our students could have their academic and emotional needs met through high-quality, restorative classrooms that are based on learning skills and building movement efficacy rather than on competitive or shame-based fitness models. Intentionally focus on your climate, use and respect that academic language. Empowering your students is a huge step towards agency, and a big piece in that empowerment is giving them the language to tell other adults how smart they are. I have never worked with a student that wasn't brilliant, but I worked with a whole lot of students that had no idea how to communicate that brilliance to their teachers. So in general, cultural fluency based on the idea of literacy development with each new genre takes more practice. The only way to change our ideas is to change our beliefs and our actions through our experience and our relationship. And we are all going to make mistakes as we move. I challenge you to think about Naomi Hartle's PE Institute speech on getting comfortable in your uncomfortable zone. Becoming a person, a teacher, a professional, a role model, a mentor, a mentee who says, you know what, my normal is going to be trying new things. My normal is going to be pushing my boundaries. My normal is going to be to continuously reflect on my actions and say, how did my power, my privilege, or my oppression inform that? How did what I teach and how I teach intersect with that? And how can I create either consequences or revisions to my actions to make sure things don't happen again that are in the best interest and best lens of the students that you're serving? So with that, my tagline is now go be awesome. But we have a few minutes. I will gladly entertain any questions or clarifications or anything else you need to know.
Yeah, I'm asking right now if anyone has any questions in the puzzle. While we're waiting for questions, I just want to tell everyone to make sure that after our session, please visit the link in our Tozzle that will take you to the Flipgrid page to tell us what you think about our session today. It's really quick, it's really simple, and no sign up is needed. So all you have to do is to submit a 1 minute and 30-second video, and you'll be entered into a drawing for a premium subscription to Flipgrid for a year, which is, again, a great, great teaching tool.
So Justin, a good privilege activity is, I don't know if you've ever done the privilege line. where you have everyone start standing on a line, and then there's a list of questions. I'm guessing you can grab it off the web. But you have, if you have ever been followed in a store because they thought you were going to steal, take 2 steps backwards. If you have ever gotten out of a traffic ticket, take 2 steps forward. And then after a series of about 15 questions on that, you have kids who are literally on polar opposites of the room. And then you have everybody turn and look at each other and see, okay, what do you notice about this? And it becomes a human graph of privilege. I've done that with as young as 5th grade, and it's been pretty powerful. So that was just, Jonathan, I saw that one question.
Yeah.
I don't know if there were others. Oh, Lorena, I'm glad you're here. Lorena's one of my students at Morgan. Go Bears.
Nice. It doesn't look like there's any more questions.
All right, well, I'd stick around for 4 more minutes to sing Old Lang Syne with anybody that wants to. But I don't actually know the words. So, all right, so if anybody has any questions, feel free to tweet me. I'll put my email address up here as well. And if you'd ever like me to share this information with your staff or colleagues, I am happy to do that as well.
Great, and thank you, everyone.
2 upcoming things, if you want to see me, I will be on a panel with Jamie Sparks and Amanda Stanek at the National School Health Conference in St. Louis for their keynote. And I'm also keynoting California AFERD, so to my SoCal friends and things that were on earlier, looking forward to seeing you there.
Nice.
All right.
Oh, we have one last minute question.
Sure.
Where can you find that last lesson idea?
It's where most of the recipes I use are.
So
don't tell my undergrads, but it's not written down.
Nice.
Oh, thanks, Justin.
All right, well, without any further ado, we would just like to thank everyone for joining us for the Phys Ed Summit. Remember that all the sessions are all archived on the Phys Ed YouTube page. So if you missed any sessions today or in any previous Phys Ed Summits, please feel free to visit our YouTube page. So have a great school year.
And huge shout out to Jonathan. He's been amazing in hand-holding through this whole experience. So thank you.
Well, thank you.
Maryland is lucky to have you.
Maryland, stand up. All right, everyone. Take care and have a great night.